Welcome to Sociology of Sexualities. I'm Dr. Tina Fetner. This is Module 2, the social construction of sexuality. But before we talk about the social construction of sexuality, I need you to understand a few things about sexuality and social order. So last module we were talking about culture, and we were especially talking about certain components of the culture that is around us, in the world around us every day. One of the things that we talked about was social norms, which are rules, both formal and informal. And another thing we were talking about was values, this idea that things are good or bad, things that we like or dislike. So I want to talk about norms and values as components of the culture that contribute to the social order, right? So you can see that out there in the world, there are rules, formal and informal. There are collective ideas about what's good and bad. And when we think about the social order, sociologists define this as patterned ways that we organize our social behavior, the patterns of social relations that form our social fabric. And these are reflective of and productive of inequalities that we might be aware of, like race, class, and gender. Right? So envisioning the social order, conceptualizing the social order is one of the things that sociologists have built many tools to help you see around you in the world. And so one of the tools we've already introduced to the class is social hierarchy. Right? So social hierarchy is a concept that helps us see a certain kind of social order. It helps us visualize a hierarchical, vertical order that separates things on a scale of better to worse, right? And so when you built your sexual hierarchy, you use the concept of social hierarchy to understand that some things were, some kinds of sexual behaviors were good and rewarded and celebrated, and other kinds of sexual behaviors were farther down on the hierarchy, rewarded less or disapproved of by some but not others, and then farther down the social hierarchy were sort of universally despised sexual behaviors that everyone agrees is bad, almost everyone I should say. So when we use concepts like social order and social hierarchy, I want to be explicit about what we're accomplishing, right? So theoretical concepts like these are useful to us as students of the society around us because they're like lenses. I like to think of them as like a pair of glasses that you can put on, bring something into focus, and then take off and put a different theoretical concept pair of glasses on, and it brings other things into focus. One of the things that's important to keep in mind is that all theoretical concepts bring some aspects of reality into focus, but they blur or leave out other aspects. There isn't one theoretical concept that helps us see everything. So the best we can do is really put on a theoretical concept, take a look at the hierarchical dimensions of sexuality, for example, and then we can use a different theoretical concept to look at something different, right? So when social hierarchy, this theoretical concept, brings into focus aspects of inequality produced by norms and values, it brings into focus the rewards and social approval at the top and the punishment and stigma at the bottom. But it might blur other kind of aspects of inequality or other contextual effects. For example, the concept of theoretical hierarchy is not particularly useful to help us understanding complex issues that don't necessarily fall easily into one place on the scale. So if you were thinking about non-consensual sexual behaviors and where to place them on the sexual hierarchy that you were building, for example, rape and sexual assault, you might think, well, this is a universally disliked and disapproved of kind of sexual behavior, right? There's laws on the books that name rape and sexual assault as crimes, right? But, however, we also know that rape and sexual assault are very prevalent, right? Very common. And the implementation of those laws is very weak, right? Very few people get convicted of rape and sexual assault. Reporting is very low. And we may observe in our everyday lives the sort of cultural values that sometimes actually elevate or celebrate non-consensual sexual encounters. Right? Some theorists have even gone so far to say that we live in a rape culture that dismisses sexual assault as a non-problem, that sort of gives some kinds of folks high fives when they accomplish a non-consensual sexual encounter. Right? So this is a contradictory kind of sexual behavior that different elements of the culture are giving us different messages about what our social norms and what our social values really are, right? And so in this case, the theoretical concept of the hierarchy isn't very useful, and we need some better tools to help us assess what's going on here. We'll talk about this more later in the class. Another thing I wanted to bring up in terms of a sort of disadvantage of this social hierarchy concept is its kind of inadequate way of bringing in intersectional perspectives, right? So different social locations receive different responses to the same sexual behavior, right? And so, for example, if you think back 30 or 40 years ago, when social norms against same-sex sexuality were stronger than they are today, a same-sex couple and a different sex couple might do the same sexual behavior, right? But have consequences that are quite different. And so the social location of the people participating in the sexual behavior really matters. And as we all know, that those social locations can be complex and multiple. They always are complex and multiple, right? And so issues of race, class, gender, age, ability, all of these things are complexities that affect the position of the sexual hierarchy, of the sexual behavior on a sexual hierarchy, and especially influence our capacity to avoid punishment or to receive rewards, right? So once again, it's concepts are good for some things, but not super good for other things. However, sociologists understand that despite the fact that we don't have a single concept that explains a social order perfectly from all different perspectives, the social order still exists, and it still is out there shaping our behaviors, giving context to the choices that we make, and making our lives interesting and complicated. Right, so another theoretical concept, the one that is the topic of today's module, is social construction. Right, so the concepts of hierarchies and social constructions can work together, right? So if sexual hierarchies are the products of, for example, laws and policies, and they're enforced by social institutions like religion, family, gender, right? How might this be related to the concept of social construction? Right? One of the things that I think it's really important for us to get is a very sort of strong fluency in the idea of the concept of social construction, because there's a lot of misuse of this concept in the world out there. Right? So, for example, you might hear somebody say that it's just a social construction. Let's say you're talking about sexual identity. Right? So they might take this to mean that it's somehow imaginary or optional, or that it's something that we can change very easily. Right? And I think that this is a misunderstanding of what sociologists mean by social construction that is quite common, right? And so I'll see this kind of dismissing kind of use of social construction in just kind of everyday life, but also sometimes in some in some theories of sexuality also kind of have this dismissive view of the power of a social construction. Right? Sociologists understand social constructions as deeply embedded within the social order, for example, governed by social norms, right? Regulated by the kinds of social institutions that we discussed on the last slide, and very difficult to make change on, right? We see social change happen, that it's not that things can't change, but it's difficult to change. It happens slowly, it happens in fits and starts, and it requires collective, institutional, and legal frameworks to shift, not just one person's sort of understanding of the social construction. Sometimes we talk about the social construction of meanings, right? And this is important too. In any social order, the meanings of the elements of the social order and of the social order itself are produced in a way that makes sense on those terms, right? So this is true both historically and culturally. The legal system is going to reflect those historical and cultural arrangements and embed those specifics in the legal framework. And within all of our social institutions, it's going to be reflected on the terms of the cultural, historical context that it's in. So let me just talk a little bit about the two ways that the two readings that you have for this week talk about the social construction of sexuality and especially sexual identity. So the extra reading that you got outside the textbook is an essay by Seamus Khan, who's a sociologist at Columbia University. And I'm going to argue that he offers a much clearer definition than the textbook offers you. The textbook, I think that you'll see, contradicts itself a little bit when it talks about social construction of two different elements of sexuality. And so I want you to keep your eye out for that. When it talks about social construction of sexuality, right, it sort of seems to imply that because sex is not necessarily a direct function only of biology, then that is how we understand it to be a social construction, right? So it makes the case that that social construction is different from biological determinism, which is correct. And that biological determinism says that sex drives are just a function of biology, but it doesn't necessarily give us the sense that there's something going on opposite for that, right? So social construction doesn't necessarily need to be opposed to biology. Something can be both biological and socially constructed, and this is where I think that Khan really is quite sharper about understanding that, someday we may discover some biological components of sexuality. And in fact, you may have read the Nature article that connected some genetic components in a complex mix to be sort of related to some sexuality just in men, not women, etc., etc. So we know that, biology is related to sex drives and sexuality in some way. We haven't sort of hammered it down yet, but we don't need sex and sexuality to be non-biological to understand that they are socially constructed. Sexuality, in fact, can be both biological and socially constructed, and the textbook gets a bit sharper on this later in the book. You'll see in a future chapter when it understands the social construction of menstruation. Right? Menstruation is obviously a biologically determined fact, but the meanings around it are cultural and contextual historically. And so this is why we understand the meanings around menstruation to be socially constructed. I would say that we can understand sexual identity in the same way as the textbook frames that. For now, let's rely on the Seamus Khan article, right, that sort of summarizes in this sentence here. Desire might be biologically driven, but it moves on tracks laid forth by human culture. The culture sort of sets the rules of the game for human behavior, and so desire can be biological and both socially constructed. Right, the social construction of the sexuality that we're dealing with in our course is inherited from a particular kind of system of meaning, right? And so I point out here that this is the Eurocentric history of sexual identity. It's the one that is influencing our culture here in Canada the strongest today. And we trace the thinking of the way that we understand sexual identity today back to about 200 years, not quite 200 years, right? So we've seen, for example, historical records of men having sex with men in absolutely every culture for which there are records available, right? So this is kind of a evidence that same-sex sexuality between men at least is near universal. Right? This is just a feature of all cultures. Some small, large, different proportion of men are having sex with other men, and that's just the way it is. What that means, whether we take that to be asexuality, a component of ourselves and asexual identity, varies greatly across these cultures. Right? The meanings of it are socially constructed. Right? So the idea of heterosexuality and its component homosexuality as an identity category, as a type of person, did not exist prior to 1800, and it really was the second half of this century where the kind of idea of heterosexuality as an identity category started to take hold. Right? Over the 1800s, heterosexuality and homosexuality were invented by psychologists and sexologists who were trying to categorize human sexual behavior and understand healthy and right sexual behavior and unhealthy and wrong sexual behavior, and we're creating kind of psychological categories of sexuality and sexual identity that shaped psychology over the next 150 years and is still shaping it today. Right? One of the things that influenced this particular formation of heterosexuality and homosexuality as a type of person was the social relations, the patterns of social behavior that were becoming common at that time. So this was the moment of industrialization. This was the Industrial Revolution, and cities were growing larger than they had been in previous years. Under conditions of European capitalism in particular cities, the largest cities, young men kind of escaped social control of sexuality by the institutions that govern sexuality in the day, right? Mostly the church, right? But also another important social institution was their families of origin, right? So under these conditions of capitalism, a new opportunity to organize one's social life around personal interests and preferences of all kinds, including sexuality, emerged for the first time. Right, so under these conditions, a sexual preference for men, by men, starts to seem like a stable part of one's identity or who I am. Right? Under other conditions, right, that kind of preference doesn't necessarily, it seems more like a behavior, right? So these conditions of capitalism, of industrialism, are really important to the social construction of sexuality and sexual identity that governs our understandings today, right? Only under these conditions, only in certain parts of Western Europe did the identity of homosexual and heterosexual make any sense, right? These conditions. Adults moved away, cities brought enough people together that the number of people who had preferences for same-sex sexual encounters could assemble together, and then also it increased the amount of leisure time that people had if they were in a certain class position, right? And so gay social clubs, enclaves, salons developed and started to create subcultures and communities of people. I want to be very clear here that under different conditions, same-sex sexual activity, same-sex sexual desire, and same-sex sexuality developed different kinds of understandings of the meaning of sexuality, right? They were there, they were different conditions, and so different understandings emerged, right? The kinds of understandings that we have today, the tools that we have to understand our sexuality, are shaped by the historical, cultural, and economic conditions, right? So this is what we mean by the social construction of sexuality, right? We understand sexuality in sociology to be embedded in our social institutions and to be shaped by the social relations of the day, right? We understand it to be a part of the economy, a part of the law, a part of the social landscape, including how high a percentage of the population is urban or rural, how households are organized, whether our families are large, multi-generational, and closely geolocated, right, like stuck to one small town, or whether they are small and nuclear and mobile and moving around, right? Religious institutions are very important in the social construction of sexuality, and in the story that I was just telling you, the sort of decline of the power of religious institutions and the rise of the power of other social institutions like psychology, medicine, and the state allowed this new development of the social construction of sexuality to emerge, right? And then other institutions like families and education. Right, so you see that when we talk about in sociology the social construction of sexuality, we are talking about something that is extremely real, extremely embedded in social institutions, and very difficult to escape or change, right? Something that's shaped by the world around us. These processes of social construction, of course, exist when we're born and are ongoing over the course of our lives. These same social institutions that I just named are also responsible for the social control of sexuality, right? Which is, of course, related strongly to our collective understandings of the social meanings, the socially constructed meanings of sexuality, right? So when we're talking about these same social institutions shaping the meaning of sexual behavior, sexual identity, or one particular sex act or another, they're also exerting some control over our sexual behavior. So when something, for example, is against the law, right, it shapes our access to that sexual behavior. Religion shapes our understandings of sexual behavior and can exert control over our sexual behavior. Our families similarly exert control over sexual behavior, and our institutions of education also exert control over our sexual behavior. Please, please be very careful in the way that you understand my use of social control, because they're not determining our behavior, right? They're exerting influence over behavior in the collective, right? So even when the law and religion, family and education are all aligned in support of one kind of sexuality and against another kind of sexuality, there always will be some people who are willing to take these social consequences in order to live their lives in ways that go against the social norms and values that are dominant in our culture at any given point in time. Okay. I also want to point out that these institutions regulate our behavior and that we are participating in the regulation of our own behavior as we internalize the socialization into the social relations that are given in our current social context, right? And they also establish codified meanings of our understanding of the social world. So hopefully now you have a strong understanding of what we mean in this class to say the social construction of sexuality, how it's related to certain concepts like sexual hierarchy, but how those concepts are limited and imperfect, and we'll need a variety of ways to understand the social order, the pattern social relations governing sexuality.